Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. We are super excited for another night of our Faith and OCD Roundtable. Tonight's topic is something a little bit different. We're really talking about starting conversations on mental health around OCD, but really around any type of mental health in faith communities. We really want to get the point across that faith and mental health do not have to be mutually exclusive, but rather you can engage in your faith practices and engage in evidence-based treatment. So we're going to be having some conversations about that tonight. But as folks are coming in, feel free to put in the chat who you are, where you're from. I know we usually ask a question at the beginning, so this has been kind of a unique, since we're on a faith live stream, this has been kind of a unique time with overlaps between Passover, Easter, and Ramadan. So I wonder if anyone who's watching has a favorite either spiritual or religious or cultural or family practice that you're doing at this particular time of the year. So while some folks are jumping on, I'd love to ask our awesome guests that. Do you have a particular family or cultural or religious ritual right now for Passover, for Easter, for Ramadan, or beyond that is meaningful to you?
Well, typically for me, I'm used to cooking or being together with family, but I'm trying to pass that on to my daughter and my sons and daughter-in-laws that they can do the cooking now. But that's basically, what we do following a course morning service.
Mm-hmm.
Just hanging out and Easter egg hunt for the kids.
Thanks, Valerie.
So I celebrate Easter, and I have a 6-year-old son. And so he's old enough now, we're trying to introduce kind of more than just the Easter bunny, right? The meaning in my faith, I'm a practicing Catholic. And so I have started reading little books with him about whether it's Christmas. And right now we've been reading Easter books and talking about the story of the Passion and the meaning of that in our family and our faith.
Oh. I love that. Thank you, Emily. And Rebecca, anything for y'all?
Well, I am a pastor, and so Holy Week and Easter is so full, so full. And I think what I'm particularly grateful for this year was it was the first time in the congregation where I'm serving. This is now my only my second Easter here, so it's my first one that we got to have in person. And we usually have a huge meal together as a community, and it's outside. And we got to do that this year, and so it was really special to do that with this community of people that I've come to love so much, but haven't been yet through all of the holidays in person in real life with them. So that was a highlight of this year.
Love that. I love that. I'll say for me, favorite is probably, so I work right now as an interfaith chaplain with students and get to do lots of different cool things. But one of my favorites is during Ramadan right now, we have some of our older students host Ramadan kind of non-lunches for our younger students who are fasting. So our 17 and 18-year-olds will host games for our students who are 10, 11, 12, 13, so that while they're not engaging in lunch with their classmates, they get to hang out with our cool upper school students and play games and do things that are really meaningful and talk about culture and tradition. And that's become, for me, one of my favorite practices, just to be with them and see those relationships forming across students from the same faith tradition, but maybe different manifestations or sects of that faith tradition. And that's pretty cool. So I think this is a great time to get started. I see we have Pauline on here, Valencia. Again, as folks come in, feel free to say hi. Excited that you're here. And I'm going to go ahead and get started with some of our introductions. So this live stream is educational and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please work with your provider or contact a local clinician. You can use the IOCDF's online resource directory at iocdf.org/findhelp to locate a trained clinician near you. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline. If you are in crisis or if you're ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room or call 911 or the suicide prevention hotline at 800-273-8255. And finally, as always, we want to create a safe space. We want to be kind and respectful to everyone. At the end of the day, we're all here to support one another. So we ask everyone to be kind in the chat, to recognize that just by being here, by engaging with one another, you're engaging in advocacy, and that's a really special thing. But also keep in mind that this is being broadcast on several social media platforms and is being recorded. So just want you to keep that in mind as you're asking questions as well. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. I'm going to share some of our bios of our awesome panelists tonight. And I see Rachel, welcome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And Leanne, I see on here too. So glad that y'all are here. And tonight we have some great folks here with us. So Valerie, who I know a lot of you probably recognize from a lot of these that we do in all of our Faith and OCD initiatives. Valerie Andrews is a retired school teacher and a full-time wife, mother, and grandmother. Following her OCD diagnosis in 2011, she began advocating in hopes of bringing awareness and inclusion within her own community and communities of faith. And today she spends the majority of her time focusing on her nonprofit, Miss Mabel Sparrows Incorporated, a nonprofit for women of age, color, and faith. And her goal is to continue working as an IOCDF lead advocate and promoting change. So she's one of our awesome rock star lead advocates, helping us to lead all things faith and OCD like we're doing here tonight.
Thank you, Katie.
Okay. And then we're super excited to have Emily Malkoon here with us, who is a clinical psychologist specializing in evidence-based treatment of anxiety and related disorders, who practices in Philadelphia and Detroit. She was a staff psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania Center for the Treatment and Study of Anxiety and completed a postdoc fellowship at Emory University Trauma and Anxiety Recovery Program. Dr. Malkoon completed a bachelor's degree in theology from the University of Notre Dame and a Master of Divinity from Harvard University. She is a member of the IOCDF Faith and Mental Health Task Force, woo woo, and a CPE certified interfaith chaplain. And we are super excited to have her joining us in these initiatives too. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here with all of you.
Awesome. And then we have Reverend Rebecca Hewitt Newson, who is a Baptist minister currently serving as pastor at Emmaus Way, an inclusive creative Christian community in Durham, North Carolina. She has also been a board certified hospital chaplain and a children's minister. She has an MDiv from Wake Forest University and a BA in religion from Elon University. Her own personal experience with OCD and treatment profoundly influences her approach to ministry and the pastoral care she offers. Her experience has also fueled her desire to advocate for others, particularly ministers, in the midst of mental health crises. So Rebecca, thank you for being here and for authentically sharing your experience too.
I'm grateful for the invitation. Thank you so much.
So we're excited to get started, and just I think I know a lot of folks at this point who are jumping on here, but if I don't know anyone, I always like to note that I put Reverend always on here just to note for folks that ordained ministers do struggle too and have OCD as well. So I like to point that out, but I'm super informal. So Katie is always perfectly fine. I'm an ordained minister. I'm an interfaith literacy teacher and interfaith chaplain and founder of Faith and Mental Health Integrative Services, which means I work to help individuals with OCD and related disorders live into their faith traditions in ways that are meaningful and value-driven as they engage in evidence-based treatment. But most importantly, and my favorite thing that I get to do is serve as an IOCDF lead advocate with Val, where we lead all things faith and mental health and help folks to know that faith and mental health do not ever have to be mutually exclusive. And that's really what we're here to talk about tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and start asking our panelists some questions. I see, Rachel, you already have an awesome question here in the chat. I would encourage you to keep loading questions into the chat. We're going to start with some general questions and then get to as many as we possibly can tonight. So again, feel free to just start dumping them into the chat as things come across your mind, and we will do our best to get there. But I'd love to just start by asking this awesome group, just in general, why are you passionate about work in the area of faith and mental health, or more specifically, faith and OCD? And Val, I'd love to start with you.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. I think for myself, before my diagnosis, I kind of felt like I was part of the flock, but like the missing sheep because I didn't know what was going on with me spiritually, and being a Christian and having grown up in the church, from a little girl, getting on the school bus with my grandfather being the bus driver and the deacon, Sunday school teacher, all that stuff. I started questioning my own spirituality. Am I a good enough Christian? Why was I having all of these thoughts? And I didn't know what to do with them. And it took me a while to learn that it was okay to share. And I think that came with growth and being in a smaller ministry and with having a church that offered a lot of support. But I started advocating because I seen such a need, especially in the Black community or communities of color. It's so steeped in tradition and culturally ideas that it was hard to break through that. And for me, it was basically, God kind of told me, now that you have this, how are you going to use it to glorify me? And kind of let me and open up all of those doors. But bottom line, it was the need that I had for myself to find what was going on. And I needed some relief in my own questioning about my own faith. Was I a weak Christian? Why was I not getting what everybody else was getting? Why was I stressing all of those things? So that's how it kind of started for me and continues to be the reason why I advocate.
Yeah, thank you, Val. And I think so many folks relate to your story because the questions that we end up getting so often from folks have to do with so many of the questions we end up getting have to do with, well, if we just prayed harder, right, like, then why wouldn't things feel better, right? And that's not the case. This is a subtype and a manifestation of OCD, right, where exposure and response prevention is super, super important. And that's one of the reasons that we're talking about this. So I wonder, Emily, so why are you so passionate about this work around faith and OCD?
Sure. So, we are holistic beings, and I really feel that faith, as well as the tools of psychotherapy and at times psychiatry, all can come together to help us be, whole, right? Our healthiest selves. And for me, this all really started during my chaplaincy training. I did CPE training. My first career was as a hospital chaplain during divinity school and after. And I was privileged to work on the inpatient psychiatry unit. And I worked with people at times back then, this was, over 20 years ago, who would have longer stays. And I got to witness and walk with people and experience kind of the different things that faith, as well as the tools of the field of psychology and psychiatry, can bring to people to restore their wholeness, right? And so in particular, I found that faith really helps people kind of during the in-between time. It brings hope, it brings strength. And at that time, there was a real skepticism in my field of psychology towards, the role of faith. The Templeton Foundation was just starting to fund research on positive religious coping. And then over the years, I really started to meet a lot of people in my clinical practice where I saw how the OCD really hijacked their faith, and no longer were they really having this relationship with the divine, with God. It was really a relationship with OCD. And so when I learned and trained in ERP, I got to see a path in the role as a psychologist to help people kind of, heal the anxiety so they could really access their faith again. And when I saw just how effective ERP can be with that, and I was really feel so fortunate that I have both the pastoral counseling as well as the ERP training, so that I've been able to, find a way to integrate those in my clinical practice to walk with people on this journey. So for me, it's really about helping people reclaim their faith as something helpful in their life. not causing anxiety and suffering, because it shouldn't be that. It's not what it is. It's not of God if it's causing us suffering, right? If it's causing that. So that's where I'm coming from. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think the work that you do is so incredibly important because you're really highlighting the fact that, faith and OCD are these separate components, and we can help people move towards these value-driven versions of their faith as opposed to this hijacked component of OCD, and that it can be value-driven as opposed to completely fear-based, as OCD tells us. And I think to have those perspectives as a chaplain and as someone who's worked in ministry and in interfaith work, and then being able to bring in that clinical perspective for religious scrupulosity, especially, is just awesome. So glad to have that perspective. And then Rebecca, I know you have the personal perspective as well. So why is this work important to you?
Yeah, I think given what Emily and Valerie have already said, I would say yes, and I agree with those in what you've shared and my own experience with how faith, I think particularly that my own personal convictions and faith community provided, Emily used the word hope, helped. It wasn't the thing that could solve my mental health crises, but it was the thing that kind of kept giving me the strength to keep going when the work was really hard. But I think for me, I come from a place that's not probably particularly skeptical of psychology or of what therapy can offer, although many religious communities are. But I think felt that the things I had learned in seminary, the things that I had learned in my own just even undergrad department, and the things I had learned in church would be enough to keep me mentally healthy. That those, the skills of listening, the skills of prayer and connecting with people, that those would be things that would keep me healthy and strong. And so for me, one of the greatest discoveries in my crisis with OCD, which didn't happen until I was in my 30s, was in addition to the good news that I preach. I was telling a friend the other day how strange it is to think I preach for, in my tradition, the good news of Jesus Christ. And I'm I also kind of want to preach the good news of CPT and ERP, right? Those are the things that I can say, saved my life, right? In a different way than my faith tradition has saved my life. And so I just think it's essential for those of us with brains like mine to have access to both those ways of practice. And so for me, I'm just passionate about helping faith communities recognize that and help ministers who are trying to figure out how do I talk about this in my communities, OCD, or in a broader way, just mental health and mental illness. So that's one of many, many things I would say about why I'm passionate about it.
Yeah, these are such important conversations. And I think just to note for folks who are watching, this is, I know, still fairly a new stream, but the reason that we are talking about this so much around this area of OCD is, for those of you who watch other OCD streams, OCD latches on to the things that are literally the most significant to us, that are the most important. It's ego dystonic. It takes everything that's important and twists it around in these ways that sometimes don't make a lot of sense to us. And for so many people, faith is the thing that's the most important to them. So OCD is kind of an equal opportunity disorder for folks who are Christian and Jewish and Muslim and Buddhist and Sikh and Hindu and beyond, and even atheist or agnostic or humanist, where it very much can latch on to your beliefs. So just noting, and I know we had some different comments on this for folks who might be new to this, we're not in any way trying to preach religion or preach faith with this. It's about helping. This is a very real subtype of OCD for folks that can latch on to something that's significant, and helping individuals in whatever their tradition looks like, whether that's a faith tradition or no faith tradition, get back to that in a way that's meaningful for them. So I think it's such an important conversation, and we're already starting to see some conversation in the chat as well. And we're going to talk tonight a little bit more specifically about that OCD piece. But first, more generally, our topic tonight how do you actually think we can get some of those conversations started in faith communities around faith and mental health? And Rebecca, I'll jump back to you because I know you just mentioned this. This is something that's very real and very timely in your work right now. So how have you gotten those conversations started, or how would you like to get those conversations started more fully so that everyone has a seat at the table?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking a lot about. And I think my immediate responses, the things that are popping into my head, are probably most apt for clergy people. So, but I'm going to try to think about also making them broader. But perhaps there are clergy who will find this and wonder how to do this. And so, I've been thinking a lot about making mental health one of the primary things that we talk about, whether it's from the pulpit or it's in prayer practice, for communities that have prayer lists, right? Like normalizing, like if people are comfortable with it, normalizing sharing those types of crises. And I think the communities I've been a part of, that's challenging, but I see that changing, where people will like put their name on the prayer list and name that it's for a mental health treatment, ongoing mental health concerns, and or naming those out loud if you're in a community that does that as well as a community. And sometimes that comes from leadership being willing to do it the first time, or somebody who is more willing to be vulnerable. But some of that is just like normal practice. We normalized lots of kinds of illness, right? And we're willing to say out loud in our faith communities, I have cancer, but we don't necessarily name for ourselves or name for our communities when we need support. I think another thing that I've thought a lot about is in my own practice as a pastor is having just like a lot of resources available and very visible in my office, and in our faith communities. So having whether it's like pamphlets present. I know these things seem like very simple things, but I have found that the more, like, if someone comes to me and says, I really need to talk about my anxiety, it's out of control. They may not even use the word anxiety, but it is. And it's like, if I can say, oh, well, here is my wall of anxiety resources, right? Or if they see it, even if they're not willing to talk about it to someone yet, they can see it in their church or in their temple. They can see those resources available and they recognize like, oh, this is something that people must need here. And has been made available. Those are two of the really simple things that I've thought about just destigmatizing and making that kind of support readily available from a leadership perspective.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that means so much to folks coming from you and coming from the leadership, because I think that's sometimes things that folks don't see. And I'll say, for me, for a long time, it was scary, very scary in ministry, where it was, ooh, if people knew I had OCD, how would they see me? Or how would they see me as a minister? Would they still respect me? Would they still, listen to the things that I'm saying? And I think being able to be in a space where you are clergy saying, I have these struggles too, and you're not alone. Oh, and also it's just like if you had a physical illness that you can treat this in a particular way, is so profound. Because I always think about the piece you said with cancer. We can think about with somebody with asthma. I think in the church, we're getting to a place where we can, and in lots of faith communities, talk about mental health, but mental illness is still really tricky sometimes, where it's we can have conversations about general mental health and about mindfulness, but specific evidence-based treatments, it can be really tough. And I always say it's like telling somebody with asthma, oh yeah, we all breathe, like, so let's just breathe together and that'll make you feel better. And it's not what we would do. You would say, oh, there's like evidence-based stuff out there. It's like, get an inhaler and go and do these treatment pieces.
I just want to say, like, yes, absolutely. I think especially in denominations, we're hearing more and more about talking about mental health. But yeah, that's different in some ways. It's become very much about like self-care. Like there's a lot of people talking about like self-care and those kind of things. But what about chronic mental illness that like really, really is impairing and really like yeah, just taking the joy like out of people's lives in our communities. So I could talk about that all night. I will let someone else answer that some questions.
Emily, jump in. What thoughts do you have on this topic? I know there's a lot.
No, I really appreciate what you're saying, Rebecca, about normalizing living with mental health issues like anxiety, depression, naming them. In my tradition, I think what can happen is that there's a message inadvertently sent that faith and feeling things like anxiety are exclusive, right? So the messaging of, well, we don't need to feel anxious because some of the rhetoric, right? Like our God has provided, or these things that have happened, right? So the idea of shifting the messaging to allow room as part of our human experience, and in the Christian tradition, we might say it's part of the incarnational theology of suffering, right? We need to expand that to include this reality and stop being in denial about it as part of the human experience. And just bringing in the science, I think especially like in my tradition, which is Catholicism, we really believe in faith and reason and data and evidence. And so I think, unfortunately, sometimes I see different messaging, not always, but really shifting away from that. If we have faith, we never worry. If we have faith, we have nothing to worry about. It's not about that, right? It's not a deficiency of faith, right? It's a characteristic of the human condition that is part of a mystery of suffering for many, just like any other medical condition. So I think this characterizing it as a medical condition when it really is so important. And then the hope of evidence-based treatments, like the good news, I always say to people, the bad news is you have OCD. The good news is you have OCD. It's the most treatable mental health condition with, ERP with someone experienced. And so I think that shifting of the messaging could make a real difference for people living with chronic mental health conditions, coming from the pulpit, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, and yeah, go ahead, Val. I would love to hear. And you've been through this of really trying to share this in your church communities. And I think this is so powerful. So what does that look like for you?
Yes, I knew this question was going to come up, and it's so important. So I'm going to kind of look at my notes a little bit. When you ask how do we start a conversation, my first instinct was like any other conversation. But unfortunately, that's not happening in the church. And I'm not trying to be flippant, but because it really should be that simple, in our congregations, even though it's going to be uncomfortable, maybe, to have that conversation, but it's definitely necessary. And I read or heard this quote that says, I'm look at my notes, show me your redeemed life that I might be inclined to believe in your Redeemer. And it's like, how can I not show that part of my life, because it's who I am? But on the other side of that, you're seeing that I have an answer for it on a spiritual level, that my hope lies in all of those things surrounding, my Christianity. And I think it's important that we start those conversations, because we should be known by our love. We shouldn't be known by judging people and being the jury and convicting people and saying, you're weak in faith, and all of those things that I have heard so often in my own walk. That and I feel we start a conversation just by being present. When somebody is talking to us, to really be in tune to what they're saying. And sometimes, like say, you don't have to say anything. It's just the fact that you're being acknowledged and recognized that this is going on in your life, and that you're still loved, you're still part of the church, you're still part of the flock. All of those things are important. On the practical side of it, like you say, starting the conversation. For myself, I started much like Emily, I think, said, doing Bible study and prayer night. I learned to be a little bit more specific instead of just saying praying for those that are sick, praying for those that have OCD and other mental illnesses. And it kind of became my norm. In the beginning, I could kind of feel like people staring at you, that kind of thing. But it became the norm. And then I went on, like Rebecca said, that I asked my pastor, can I just leave some resources, in the vestibule as people were leaving. And I also asked him to, could he do a sermon during Mental Health Week? So that's how I did.
Mhm.
When it comes to personally, uh, I find for me in the beginning, it was easier to try to have a one-on-one conversation with somebody within the church that I felt comfortable with. And I'm a big person on reading other people's books, memoirs. I would do that. So there's really, in my opinion, no wrong way to do it. You might not get the results that you are looking for in the very beginning, but I think it's so, so important to start the conversation. And that's my whole passion, to start it. And I try to keep that conversation going, but I also don't put that burden on myself. I try to start it, but it's not up to me to keep it going. It's up to those that we're telling, we need your help, that sort of thing. But bottom line, it should just be as simple as anything else. As simple as saying, hey, pray for me because I have high blood pressure,
Mhm.
or I'm having surgery on my knee. We shouldn't be so afraid, and the church shouldn't be so rigid, sometimes with the simple stuff, because it can make a difference. It made such a big difference in my walk, in my ability to keep moving forward, and my ability, going back to what I said, where people could see the Redeemer in me, by me showing that I need him, and I can talk about all of these things, and it does not make us less than. So,
Mhm.
and I can go on and on and on too. Let me hush.
No, you're awesome. And this is, I mean, what you're speaking about is so relatable for so many across faith traditions. And this is what we're going to be talking about at the upcoming Faith and OCD conference in just a couple weeks, on May 9th, for folks who are excited about this topic. The fact that there can be, these are hard conversations to have. These are really tough conversations to have. It can be really, really scary. And yet there are things that we need to be talking about in our churches, in our mosques, in our synagogues, in our temples, in our jamatkanas, right? And I always say, for me, I was terrified to start to have these conversations. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm clergy with intrusive thoughts and these false memories, and what will people think about me? And they won't want me to pastor anymore. And when I got to the point where I was in a good place because of ERP to start sharing about my experience, it was very much the opposite. I was serving as a chaplain to 2,700 kiddos and started hearing from families, not that they didn't want me to be their chaplain, but it was more like, oh, wait, now I can tell you my family's struggling with mental illness. And I didn't know where to go because I didn't think this was accepted by our faith communities. And I think there's a lot more openness to this conversation than maybe we even recognize. So I know we have some questions here about faith and OCD specifically, but to get into that, Emily, I'd love to go back to what you mentioned a second ago that is so important. We're talking about this at the conference in just a couple weeks, that religious scrupulosity and OCD around religion specifically, which I know that some folks are on here for tonight, is not a faith issue. It is an issue of OCD. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit and talk just a little bit about just basics on ERP and how exposure and response prevention might be used in terms of obsessions around religion.
Sure. So, well, in ERP, what we're doing is we're coming up with a plan to kind of reset the alarm system so that the OCD isn't hijacking people's faith and turning it into something that scares them anymore. And what scrupulosity OCD is, it's, when people worry about offending God, sinning, being a bad person, that they might go to hell. And They might get intrusive worries, images that are very terrifying, and then feel that they need to do something, either a mental or physical compulsion, or avoid situations to make sure that what they fear doesn't happen, right? So in ERP, we would treat this content like any other OCD content, right? So whatever the OCD is attaching to, whether it's harm compulsions, contamination, perfectionism, or scrupulosity, we're going to use the same treatment techniques to tackle the OCD. So whatever content OCD is trying to scare people about, the treatment approach is exactly the same. All right. And so what we know is that doing compulsions and avoidance strengthens those fears. So in ERP, we do the opposite. And I like to use the analogy of, if we want to win against OCD, we need to win the game against OCD. And ERP, exposure and ritual prevention, is like playing a basketball game where you have an offense and a defensive plan. So exposure is like going on the offense and scoring points against the OCD. And ritual prevention is when you're on the defense throughout the day and OCD tries to come at you, trigger you, scare you. We work with people to teach them how to tolerate their anxiety and their fears and resist doing these compulsions, because they're really praying for OCD. It's not really the type of prayer, for instance, when that's the ritual, that's allowing the person to access what the true purpose of prayer would be. So what we do is we do exposures in a way that is not going to actually ask somebody to do something that's truly against their real faith, right? That's really compromising their faith, but that's consistent with their faith and their beliefs and their values, but is really kind of bringing back the rituals that the OCD is asking of them. So it's kind of a nutshell of how we would do it. Sometimes we might, consult with a clergy member or ask people questions like, what does somebody who, practices your tradition typically do? So for instance, something like the Sacrament of Reconciliation or confession in Catholicism. You might have someone with OCD who's going, every day or multiple times a week, and that's not generally how it's practiced in our tradition. So you can kind of ask somebody, we don't want to steal this from you. How do we make it truly a resource again for your faith and not something that's feeding OCD? So ritual prevention would look like working with the person to kind of establish an appropriate frequency, right? Or the purpose of it. We're not going to have you go to confession when you're worried, but when maybe there's something that's real in your life that's having you confront sort of your humanity and an area in your life you want to truly grow around, right? Maybe like for me in my life, sometimes I have a temper and I might have a short temper with my husband. So I might go to the Sacrament of Reconciliation to kind of reset with myself around that, because I really feel genuine sorrow about that, right? But if I'm just going because I'm terrified I'm going to go to hell, if I don't confess this, then that would be OCD. So that might be an example in that particular tradition of how we would work with it. And then you might do exposures around things like you might say things that, negative things about God, or you might leave church late, or in Orthodox Judaism, you might ask somebody, what does the OCD make you think is violating keeping kosher, but really in your community would not be? And so you start putting together a list of some of these actions that kind of score points on the OCD without actually violating the traditions.
I love that terminology around scoring points without violating. I always tell folks, there's a difference between, and it looks different for each person. I think this is what's tough, and it can look different across different sects and different denominations, but there's a difference between discomfort and disrespect for an individual person. And we want to get into that discomfort place. We want to lean into that discomfort without crossing, into a line for disrespect of someone in their tradition. And the reason I make that really clear is for folks to hear. I think sometimes there's a resistance to engaging in ERP because there's fear that a clinician is going to ask you to do something that's totally in opposition to your faith. And you will have to do things that are uncomfortable. But Emily, to your point, and you can answer this too, they're not going to be asked to do something that's completely and utterly against their entire faith tradition.
Right. So you really always start out with like, what are your actual beliefs? Right. Like I'll ask people, when would you actually pray if it wasn't driven by fear? Right. And then we can create our ritual prevention guidelines from that. When might you, if your OCD isn't active, allow yourself to leave, your service early or arrive late, right? So things like that. And then sometimes we do work with people to do things that feel more extreme that you would never do, but with the understanding that this is about fighting back OCD, and that, if this is a person, say, who, has a belief in God, I'll say, God is cheering you on as you swear at him, because this is about OCD. God is big enough. God is big enough, the divine spirit can handle a few words here. Because this isn't really you cursing God. This is, so the idea of thought action fusion, you don't really feel this way, right? We're just saying words. So sometimes if there's things that feel more uncomfortable, we do a little more psychoeducation around differentiating between that we're really treating a medical condition here. And this is a contained purpose. This isn't something you're going to keep going out in your life and doing. We're doing it right now for a very specific purpose, to treat your suffering. And look, is it possible God's even like in the room with us when we're doing this?
I love that you said,
sorry.
go ahead, Val. Sorry.
I was going to say, I'm so glad she brought that point up, because I know for me, and I'm 66, so I bring a lot of that culture and stuff with me. It's like, how did we get to this place where we believe that if we go to the therapist, like say that we're outsourcing Jesus, that it's not fair. I don't go to the therapist to treat my spiritual man. That's what I go, to my faith community or my pastors, for, just like I don't go to my pastor to teach me how to do ERP.
Right.
It's two separate things. And I finally got to the point for myself where I had to take ownership of, this is my responsibility in a sense, uh, because our walks are also different and so personable and so different, our journeys, that there's a common ground we all walk, but then it's so individual. And so I just decided that I was going to take ownership of, this is the cross I've been given to bear. I didn't choose it, and I'm a 1000% sure that I wouldn't have chosen it, because it's such a horrible disorder to have. And I think that's what people don't really understand because of all the stigma. But once I allowed myself that freedom as a Christian to say, this don't have nothing to do with, God and believing in healing and all of those things that tradition can wear us down. I got so tired of hearing, oh, you're too blessed to be stressed. No, I'm stressed, but I'm still blessed because I have all these other avenues. And for myself, I realized, like I said, by taking my own ownership, that uh, it got me where I wanted to go. It got me to where I needed to go. I was stuck believing all that stuff about being a Christian and being weak and not knowing how to pray, and God is going to be mad, and all of those things, to realizing that there's hope on the other side. And for me, it's through therapy, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a blessing. And so when I kind of allowed myself the ability to merge the two and go, we both need each other. For me, I needed both. I needed the clinic and I needed the church in order to move forward. And that has been so uplifting, and taking some of that burden off me. Because like I said, I've been at this a long time, and I also like to tell people too, when I'm talking, I didn't come to all of this overnight. I don't want to make it sound like I was this super Christian, or, I had all of this stuff, all of this knowledge. I didn't. It came with me realizing, being older, I don't have time for all of that stuff. that somebody young might have. Whatever I'm going to do to move this agenda forward, I need to do it now. And I think that's what kind of drives me too, because at this age, it's like, I don't need anybody's permission. You know what I mean? And so that has helped me. But for me to allow myself, like you say, you can have both. And it means absolutely nothing. It means you're human. We get sick like everybody else. And this is our remedy.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's so true, though both of those pieces can fit together. And going back to what Emily said, we tell folks the same thing. I work with a lot of folks who are nervous about ERP and nervous in engaging in that particular way. And it's funny, we use the same tactic. I say almost every day to folks, God can handle your exposures, right? And in your faith tradition, if you see the divine as all powerful, then probably can handle that thing that you're doing with everything else going on in the world. And if you see the divine as all loving, probably wants you to engage in ERP so that you can love this beautiful life that you've been created to live. And God can handle those things that we're doing in order to reclaim our faith and our beautiful life. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
I was going to say, if you can create like irreverence for the OCD and separate that out from reverence for the true way God is, like I often start out, what is your actual image of God? And is that consistent with what this OCD terrorist in your brain is trying to tell you? Like, and then you can, I'll be like, yeah, because God is not big enough to handle if you leave 5 minutes late. Catholics leave late all the time. It is probably more normal than not. Okay. I'm not saying it's no judgment one way or another about it, but it's a norm. It's accepted, right? And so no, God cannot handle that from you. You're the one that can't do it, But separating out that irreverence, I think, from the OCD starts to give people an ability to differentiate between their medical condition and how it's starting to really take over their faith, and then, see their actual faith again and their actual beliefs and theology, and then use that to kind of call out the OCD lies.
And you can really separate that. And we do the same thing. I mean, I do a lot of work with, okay, where's the fear, like you said, and where's the meaning? Where's the hope? Where are you finding joy versus where's the fear? Where's the obligation? Where are these things that you have to do? And how do we move towards this area of meaning and away from this area of, I have to do this so that something horrible doesn't happen? And it's different. So Rebecca, I wonder, pulling this back around, and I've seen a couple questions. So just to pull in a couple different questions from the chat about folks' faith and guilt and fear and anxiety. A lot of times we'll hear we went back, Val mentioned this a little bit earlier, we'll hear this idea that, well, if someone just prayed harder, right, they wouldn't have anxiety, or if they were just more faithful, like God would take this away from them. So we're talking from the OCD perspective that probably not true, but I wonder how, from a faith perspective, how you might respond to someone in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of it has to do, right, with what is our vision of God, right? So, if we're coming from an image of God that is, let's say all loving, or let's just say God as parent, right? If your tradition sees God in any way as a loving parent, right, then how do we feel about, like, what do our children have to do to gain our love, right? Do we, right? Like, would we interact with our children that way, right? To say, like, what's only if you do so much, right? And if you don't work hard enough, then I'm really not interested in being your parent anymore, right? Like that, like kind of tapping into that value system and helping people understand that, that God probably is not going to treat us worse than we treat our own children. So it's like tapping into that image of God, right? Unfortunately, I think unfortunately, like, so many of us do have like a fearful image of God. And I think a lot of it depends on, the way that we have, the theology that we have been raised in, or we have chosen in the communities. And I think often we don't recognize how we don't think that theology is something that can actually harm us often, right? That like ideas about God that are taught is something that could actually do real damage, right? Like I don't want to go to a doctor who hasn't been to medical school, but like often we listen to people talk about ideas about God that are not helpful, that are not sound, that are not that don't hold up to either our religious scriptures or traditions or our own experience. And so, yes, and I'm seeing this note from Lydia about just naming like how much like her image of God is wrapped up in the OCD, and I think in those obsessions. And so I think I love, Emily, what you said about naming that first, and like what is your idea of God. And I think also the fear piece that I think we've all named in a different way, because I think even in like spiritual counseling or direction, like being able to sort out when fear is your motivator is a huge thing. And to be able to identify that like in the religious traditions, like God is not acting out of that fear, right? When we're acting out of fear, that's not hearing the Holy Spirit or whatever it is in your tradition. That doesn't come out as fear. Right. But that instead it comes out of another place, right? We make the best decisions when we're coming out of a place of peace or a place of love or a place of courage or a place of hope. We make very poor decisions when we're coming out of a place of fear. So being able to identify what your motivator is and why you're doing those practices, I think is so important. And I think the last thing I'd say is like if people could heal their suffering by praying it, we wouldn't have so many like praying for it nonstop. We wouldn't have so many hurting people, right?
And we wouldn't need a God.
Yeah. And it's not for lack of trying, and it's not for lack of faith, prayer, belief, or goodness of their hearts that people suffer. It's especially with OCD, right? Like it's you can pray all you want, but that's not going. You're not going to be able to pray your way out of OCD. That's what I would say.
So glad.
As a non-therapist.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that for folks to hear. And what I tell folks often is that'll say, well, why didn't God take this away from me? And it's, well, your answer to prayer maybe is this evidence-based treatment that can really, help you reclaim your life. Like that can be an answer to prayer too. And I love the piece that you brought up that not all faith communities also are healthy. And I think that's important to note for y'all to hear from clergy and from folks who do work in the field of religion, that religious trauma very much is real. And there are sometimes spaces that folks have gone theologically that have not been helpful with their journey in life or in their journey with OCD. So for folks that have navigated that, I'm also sorry for the ways that OCD can continue to make that more challenging. But I still think there is hope in moving back to a tradition in a way that is healthy and value driven for you and in the relationship that you want to have. Along those lines of some different beliefs, I love John Smith's question at 726. Do you see any differences in the presentation, treatment, and outcomes of scrupulosity in the liberal and conservative Christian faith? And Emily, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I think, John, just my initial kind of piece is the obsessions that we have can look totally different just based on our theologies and on the ways that we're reading scripture. And there's OCD maybe on both sides, but you might have very different ways that presents. So I wonder what your thoughts would be, Emily. Yeah.
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I can say that, what I tend to see being where there's a lot of overlap is in what we call the core fear, right? So the fear of, angering God, being a bad person, eternal suffering. The places where we may see differences is kind of how it manifests, right? So how the rituals show up, okay? So for instance, with more conservative people of faith with more conservative traditions, you might see certain practices around prayer rituals or quiet time Bible studies, things like that. Whereas in more liberal presentations, it might be centered. I tend to see it more centered on how people are interacting with other people, to be honest with you. But at times, it really does depend more, I'd say, on the tradition than sort of this spectrum of conservative versus liberal theology. That's where you would see, I think, more differences in terms of the ritual presentation. So how is it attaching culturally to one's religious tradition? And also, scrupulosity can affect people who aren't even actually sure they believe in God. It's more like, if there is a God, I don't want to be messing up just in case, and so again, I think what we want to do to really get power over the OCD is go back to that core fear. And you can do the same thing with somebody who even identifies as authentically agnostic and say, okay, if there were a God, what would you think the God was like? This evil genius, or like, what's your experience as a human being, right? So again, I think the core fear really tends to be the same across traditions. And we want to kind of start treatment. I think what can really help people, and people can do this whether they're clergy or, a psychologist can have this conversation and stay in their lane, asking somebody, what are your actual beliefs? And let's use that as our bank of knowledge we're going to go back to. And anything other than that, we're going to treat as an OCD lie. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, can I add something?
They can't do that for themselves. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh no, I just wanted to add, this is from my own personal experience. I think I had a hard time identifying mine as scrupulosity because it was so values based and existentially based.
Yeah.
It didn't seem to latch on to like specific religious practices. But it really was about my core fears and my core values. And I think, and I had a hard time finding information or people's experiences with existential OCD, questions about what is reality and, those kinds of things, which was much more sort of in my lane as a liberal progressive Christian to talk about my values and like how I live and am I actually a good person, and the kinds of questions that were being thrown up at me from my OCD, right, mirrored a lot of what I did care about. But and I hope that Emily, you'll jump in if I'm saying something that's helpful. But I'm just saying from my own personal experience, because the identifier doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't matter if it's scrupulosity or something else, right? Like the theme doesn't matter.
Yep.
But I think it was sort of this recognition of like, oh, well, this is actually how I live out my faith. Like those are the core pieces that are so important to me. And that's why it's like latching on to these questions, even though they don't seem outwardly maybe religious in nature. So
for sure.
My experience was kind of similar to yours. And I know for me, one of the big issues I had and what I continue to struggle with sometimes is scripture itself. And that's because I'm learning to, like I say, study myself, to be study myself to show that I'm approved. But even the one that talks about as a Christian, we're not to have any sort of anxiety that is sinful, and I'm not disputing that. I'm not, going against the word or anything. But for me, what I learned that I had to do was look at the scripture in like you say, in a loving and a kind way for Valerie, because that following scripture also talks about or says to me, okay, God is saying, or Jesus is saying, okay, now that you have this, because you're going to, have anxiety, you're going to do this and you're going to do that. But here's the remedy, that following question. I know you're going to have it, but this is what you can do. And that has helped me tremendously, that I try not to use, or I should say, my experience has been that the scripture was often used as a weapon, a conviction. See, this is this, that sort of thing, as opposed to a loving way to say, okay, Valerie, you have this. And I'm talking about even coming from my clergy or even people, other Christians. It was that conviction as opposed to that love was missing, you know, you know what I mean? And it made such a big difference that I learned not to take little tidbits of the word, uh, but to try to find God's goodness in what He's saying to me individually.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I so appreciate, and I know, oh, Emily, go ahead, and then I'm
Oh,
gonna, do you want to say one thing? I can tell you have one more thing to say. No worries.
no, I just wanted to say, Rebecca, I really appreciate you bringing up the existential OCD piece because I do think that there really can be that overlap. Almost like a Venn diagram where you have like scrupulosity, religiosity. It's very clearly about like sin and blasphemy and all that, right? And then you have the existential stuff, which is like, am I going to turn into a robot? And what's the nature of reality? But if where they overlap can really be about sort of the nature of, the afterlife or just all of these other sort of there is this whole area where there's a lot of overlap. And I think to go back to the participants' question about you do see that too. I think with a lot of people with liberal progressive faith or just people who are really drawn to mysticism, for instance, where there's a lot of like interest like about the mystery, sort of dwelling more in that aspect of faith. But our core OCD just wants to like destroy our core values, and lie to us that we're not, living them to the best that we can. And Val, to what you said, I always love to go back to. I really sometimes I'm so grateful for my pastoral counseling training as a psychologist because I could do things like say, yeah, because Jesus didn't like stop the people from stoning that woman, that like, yep, this is who he is. He's just gonna like, for people who are Christian, who might be, a client that I'm working with, for instance, you really can find these places too in scripture, and OCD is going to find all the other places to reference and draw.
Yes.
It's not going to find, where Jesus got really angry, or doubted God, on the, and in other faith traditions, finding where those models might be. Moses had a lot of doubt and said, no, thank you. No, I don't want to do what you're asking him. Not me, So we can find these examples, but I think what OCD wants to do is sort of steal the whole context of the Holy Scriptures, and I see all of those stories there to kind of mirror all of our experience, the times when we feel, hopeful, the times when we feel discouraged. So just wanna-
I'm so glad that you pulled that in and the value piece, and just as we close out, I know we could talk about this for a lot longer, which is why I'm going to invite everyone to the Faith and OCD conference to continue the conversation. But that values piece that we're talking about, again, goes back to the content doesn't matter. The content is all just kind of the stuff that we think is important, that we're latched on to because of our values. And if that's something that's resonating with folks, our last town hall, actually our March town hall, was on navigating your values when OCD attaches and twists your values. So if that's an interesting topic for you, go back and check out our March town hall where we really dove into that piece. And that's really what we see happening here too. So just in closing tonight, I hope that you have heard that it is not, when we're talking about these kind of faith concerns, it is not a faith issue. It's an OCD issue that's often going back to our core fear. And just for anybody to hear, again, as a minister with OCD, my core fear has taken on lots of different forms in lots of different areas, from religious group to harm to POCD to false memory to real event OCD, that all go back to that core theme for me of, well, what if I'm a bad person, right? Like, what if I am a horrible, awful person and I don't know it? And, even after years of treatment, just saying that out loud right now makes me kind of queasy, because that's always it for me, right? It's always comes back to that. What if I am not good enough and I'm just a bad person? And I think it's really important, like Emily said, to know what our core fear is, because it can take off into all of these different areas, whether that's, again, this religious piece we're talking about tonight or something else. So thankful for folks being on here tonight. I know this is a much larger conversation, which is why I want to encourage folks to continue with us in so many different areas. So a couple announcements. Registration is open for the annual IOCDF Research Symposium in July, where we invite researchers and students to share data and findings from their latest OCD and related disorders research. This year's symposium will be a hybrid in-person and online event. You can learn more and register at iocdf.org/symposium. And tomorrow you can tune in for a brand new Ask the Experts with Dr. Liz McInvale and Chris Tronson, two of our amazing advocates, at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Pacific. And registration is also open for the 27th annual OCD conference taking place in Denver this July. Yeah, Val and I are saying yes, we definitely want you to be there. We're going to be, as advocates, hosting lots of fun events, including things like karaoke and trivia, in addition to things about OCD. And we want you to be there with us. So please join this special event for the entire OCD and related disorders community, which includes individuals, families, supporters, therapists, and researchers. And you can learn more and register at iocdf.org/OCDCon. And finally, the IOCDF's Faith and OCD Conference is happening tonight, which everyone here is super excited about. This online conference is for faith members, faith leaders, and mental health professionals. You can get more info and register at iocdf.org/faithconference. And we really hope to see you all there. Please know that if cost is remotely a barrier, there are scholarship opportunities there as well, because we want to make sure that everyone is welcome. And yeah, I see some folks that are super excited. I know Christy in the chat is a part of our Faith and OCD SIG, who has been planning some of this work, and just awesome things. And then join us also for the 1 Million Steps for OCD Walk this June and October. Find a walk near you and register today at iocdf.org/walk for a day of community, advocacy, and fun. So lots of stuff going on. And just to note, again, this live stream is just one of many. You can see the whole schedule. You can submit questions and suggestions for future streams at iocdf.org/peaceofmind. And you can also view recordings of past live streams on IOCDF's YouTube channel, youtube.com/IOCDF. Please remember to like and subscribe to get notified when live streams are scheduled. And to be notified of when we're going live, follow the IOCDF on social media and subscribe on YouTube. Finally, if you need resources, please visit iocdf.org. We are always so happy to be here with you on streams. Oh, yes, May 9th for the Faith and OCD Conference, folks in the chat who are asking. May 9th, and we want you to be there. We want to be there with you. And just as we close tonight, please remember, for anyone who's watching live or who's watching at a later time, you are completely not alone. We are on this journey together, and there is so much hope. OCD isn't a faith issue. It is an OCD issue. And yet there is this awesome evidence-based treatment, because you deserve a beautiful, awesome, amazing present life. And we are so excited to be with you on the journey, and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye, y'all.
Yeah, because your voice matters. This is how we build a community. Start the conversation.